Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another session of the Delphi Economic Forum. This afternoon we'll try and be as interesting as possible, even entertaining, I hope, trying to teach how people can make money. We're going to talk about business, how money is created, how jobs are created, how we can all prosper. But in order to do that, we have to understand how decisions are taken within corporations, whether they be it family or otherwise, and how this process is done throughout generations or within our own context currently through the different ages which exist within a corporation. In order to do so, we've got the creme de la creme with us today, people with ample experience in the professional sphere and who have proven their worth throughout time. Now, I will begin with the guest on my right, Mrs. Alexia Bakoyannis, who is CEO of Air Relate. Welcome to this panel. And I will continue with Tommaso Di Giovanni, who is VP Market Activation and Support and Global Communications at Philip Morris International, which over here exists as Papachristou in one of its capacities. And I will proceed with Mr. Yiannis Papachristou, who is Deputy CEO for Chipita Foods, one of the pillars of Greek industry, if I may be allowed to say. And of course, with Wayne Clarke, an associate partner at Crowe Global, which hardly needs any introduction as it is one of the leading globally accounting networks. Well, welcome to everyone.
Thank you.
And the actual topic, because we have to mention that at some point, is understanding corporate decision-making across generations. Now, as we've seen in the past, we can see that question both throughout time and internally throughout generations within companies, or indeed how a company pushes on a message through the different age gaps within society. But I will leave you to make your decisions and give us your take. Alexia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Drossos. I decided to start this conversation by stating the obvious. And because I'm going to state the obvious, I'm going to look a lot at my notes, okay? So, there are two kinds of companies, family-owned businesses and publicly traded ones. What they have in common is how they began. They all started somehow by the forward-looking vision or the practical idea or the entrepreneurial spirit of a key personality, the founder. And I'm going to do a parenthesis and say, thereby ensuring that patriarchy will live on forever, closing the parenthesis. The founder made all corporate decisions which were dictated to the rest of the organization. A star quality leader that created followers, like a corporate influencer of sorts. As companies began to become publicly traded, a new reality regarding decision-making emerged. At this public sphere, society's need to know whom to hold accountable brought about a growing need for transparency, which has now become the urgent sine qua non norm. This need increased dramatically over the last decade to the effect of setting specific laws that govern how listed companies make and, most importantly, publish their decisions. In fact, corporate decisions became collective rather than individual. The rise of stock exchange in global economy set the new status quo in corporate decision-making, thereby setting the pace for non-listed companies as well. As society moves forward, an increasing demand spearheaded by younger generations gave voice to the need to look closely at the how, the who, and the why of corporate decisions, irrespective of ownership status. In fact, all contemporary company structures are now required by definition to operate collectively. The time when major decisions were made behind big wooden doors by 2 or 3 very wise men, I'm clear, men, I believe is at the beginning of its end. Those from older generations that are still holding on to the helm gave way to the new reality, and younger generation decision makers embraced the possibilities of the diversity of opinion sharing. An intergenerational subversion of decision making is now a reality. The new generation of entrepreneurs, CEOs, board members, shareholders, and what have you, are now open to co-formulating strategies that inform decisions. In my opinion, to the benefit of all, of course. Transparency and accountability put corporate decision-making under public scrutiny for wages, working conditions, hiring and firing, waste management and environmental sustainability, new technologies deployed, and countless other decisions about production, investment, and distribution that impact not only the lives of their employees, but the social, political, economic, and environmental conditions of their communities. It involves professionals of different backgrounds, beliefs, stamina, ambition, and even, and more importantly, of different agendas. In a sense, this public scrutiny has democratized corporate decision-making. Being transparent and being accountable is a universal must, as the landscape of decision makers is changing and millennials and the Generation Z are making more and more corporate decisions. A democratic watchdog of sorts is the all-seeing eye that ensures the general public is protected by having access to whatever information is pertinent knowledge about the company. Of course, corporate decision-making now cannot be based on opinions or hunches. In reality, decision-making cannot even be rational in the way it used to. It is based on data, on bias embedded in the gazillions of information that cannot be processed with any certainty. In understanding corporate decision-making across generations, we are forced to take into account the possibility of inaccurate or manipulated information, which compromises the insight that businesses, institutions, and even governments now depend on to make critical decisions. We all are very aware how nothing highlights generational differences more clearly than technology, and access to information which turns everyone into a potentially crucial news magnifier. In today's fast-paced business environment, careful consideration of the available decision option is important. But not everyone at an intergenerational business decision table brings the same insight and information to participate effectively in the process. Established generation professionals may have a black or white point of view. On the other hand, younger generation participants can have a limited viewpoint about possible options and consequences, or vice versa. In the absence of the one almighty decision maker that we were talking about before, who manages the process in the battle between experience and historical insight versus forward out-of-the-box boldness, the loudest voice in the room versus the most experienced voice in the room actually have equal say. Different generations put different barriers, limits, expectations, and considerations on the decision table. They may all want the same thing, but they might understand it, let alone approach it differently. All in all, the democratization of corporate decision-making in today's business world may give wings to endless possibilities in powerful and unexpected ways that may create amazing results. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Alexia, and I think you've hit the nail on the head, being quite blunt about it, because democracy is what it's all about. And I was wondering, let's move on to our next speaker. Before, I have a couple of things to ask you, which have really are really intrinsic to this democracy, this debate. But let's keep it equal and fair. And I think we will move on to Tommaso, because you have a lot of experience to share with us, and I'm sure people are eager to know how they can make money in a more democratic corporate society.
Yes, and look, contrary to my colleague here, I don't have notes, because I decided to come just with my feelings and experience and just share it with you. And
because you talk better than I do.
I wish I did. But no, look, the truth is, I'm building on some of the points you raised, because when we talk about corporate decision-making across generations, I think that means at least two things. It means, do different generations decide differently? And is the decision on point A different 20 years ago and today? And I think the second point is at least as key as the previous one. So let me address both. The first one is, do people today decide differently than in the past? And I would say, of course, yes. You named a couple of the factors why that happens. One is this amplitude of data that we all have access to, Now, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, it's debatable, because I also see an overwhelming amount of data being shared every day. So I think there the key question is which data are valid, which are not, and how do we winnow out those data? How do we decide which ones are relevant to our problem? How we decide we're not? And I see it in my company. I have access to a variety, a humongous variety, actually, of data. And I think the key point is every time which ones of those data are relevant to my problem. How do I screen those data? And then how do I get through the biases of some of those data, which may be built for a reason? So that's the first thing. The second issue, as you said rightly, is today, this generation has a different tendency when they consider transparency. With the advent of the internet, and you're totally right on it, everything is public, which is a good thing, but at the same time, it's also a bad thing, because either people have the right lens to judge the data, the facts they see in this multitude of transparency, or that actually may be misleading. I mean, if you think about it, a lot of, and now I'm going into politics, not companies, but think about some of the recent political campaigns and the use of targeted digital to influence masses. And I'm not going to name them, I mean, everyone knows. That can be a very good thing if the population has the right information to decide. Can also be very manipulative if the population can't winnow the right from the wrong. So this is with regards to those who decide, right? And there is definitely a difference, because I wasn't used. I mean, I'm 47, and I wasn't used to things like the internet, mobile phone. My wife, who's a bit younger, always asked me, she goes, when you were a student, did you have access to the internet? The truth answer is no. At the early days of my student life, I didn't have the internet. I used to go to the library. I used to take books. I needed to find the right books, the right information in the books. It was a totally different research. Right now, you Google something, your problem is, what in this multitude of things am I going to consider? So definitely people have changed and their mindset has changed. Then decisions made today are easier in a way than in the past. I mean, if I take my industry, or let's take the car industry. Right now, the car industry is going through a real shift from oil to electric, right? And if we looked at that decision with the lens of 20 years ago, it wouldn't be fair. So across generations, the conditions that facilitate the decision have changed, right? 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, you didn't have that need to look for electric.
The language, the understanding.
The language, the understanding has changed, right? And if I apply it to my industry, I mean, we as a company are driving a change out of cigarettes into products that are not combustible, less harmful. Could we have done that 30 years ago? I mean, it's easy to say you could have done it earlier. No, because we didn't have the battery technology, we didn't have the science. Society wasn't ready for that change. Science wasn't there. So it would be easy with the lens of today to say, why haven't the decision makers in your company done it 30 years ago? Because they couldn't. It's very simple. Conditions need to be there from some decisions. Okay. And this is really, just to open the debate, a couple of considerations on the decision makers and the decision itself.
So if I were to keep one word from Alexia, it would be democracy. One word from you, it would be time. Yiannis, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. The subject is really very wide, and I think probably we need a full Delphi forum to explain all the aspects. And therefore, I will focus only on a couple of dimensions which I think are determining in affecting the decision making, and I will explain a little bit how they have evolved in the recent days. I think in every single organization, there are three major forces that drive the decision making. Those are the culture of the organization, the leadership style, and the structure of the organization. All those three have significantly affected from three, I would say, mega trends I consider really very relevant. The first one is the age diversification, diversity. Actually is the first time we have so many generations in the same working environment. The second is the only certainty that there is plenty of uncertainty. And the third one is the global climate crisis. So all the successful organizations I know, they have embedded in their business model, I think, a couple of considerations, a couple of major changes to address these three megatrends. And I will explain what are these three ones. The first one, new modern leadership style. Is the first time in the history of the planet that there are 4 different generations from baby boomers. I'm not a baby boomer.
He didn't have internet when he was at college, and nor did I, to be honest.
To the generation Z, I'm neither generation Z, as you understand, my son is. So the value system of each generation is very different. So a leadership style that can speak only to one of them, it's impossible to go further. Therefore, some, I would say, new decision-making behaviors has emerged. I will just mention 3 of them. Empowerment. Okay. I cannot imagine a young person like my son. On the other side, you need inclusiveness, because baby boomers should not felt excluded. Also, transparency across the board. The second has to do with uncertainty. I see a major transformation in the structure of the companies from the old paradigm of vertically driven, shaped companies with the functions, marketing, sales, logistics, whatever, to a more horizontal way of managing the companies, which is what we call agile way of working. This is exactly the paradigm used by all the digital companies. There, it's not the function that prevails, it's the objective of the company. Is where the people come in the same table, and what it counts is the expertise of the person, not the position and the power of the boss. This goes to the democracy, exactly as Alexia said. You cannot lead an organization, you cannot make decision which is horizontally shaped using old style of giving orders, etc. And the last one, which has to do with the climate change, I think every single company, and if there are some exceptions, very soon none of them will be an exception, must integrate, and they have integrated in their system, in their business model, the circular economy. Once you make the decision to press the button and say, I join the circular economy or the ESG principles, it's done. It means a couple of important elements integrated in your business model that will affect your decision-making forever. For a very simple reason, I will just summarize in one sentence. In the past, when this parameter was not on the table, a business leader was needed only, as Alexia said before, maybe just to make money. Good. In nowadays, with so many stakeholders outside affecting you making money, that if you just consider doing your job internally and you forget what happens externally, and then to integrate all of this in the decision-making process internally, better to get out of the business.
Very interesting view. And I think the one word that comes out of all this is initiative. I was always wondering why the Israelis do so much better in all sorts of fields, but particularly in businesses and startups. And I think initiative and the allowance of that is key to having a more democratic, as Alexia says, way of running things. Wayne.
Thank you, Nikos.
Thank you.
I guess, again, building on so many good comments and thoughts here, I've personally had the opportunity to now meet with over 700 CEOs and work with over 700 CEOs in 700 organizations in more than 30 countries. So if you can imagine 700 CEOs on a spectrum, from the deeply empathic CEO who wants to hug you all day to the clinical psychopath on the other side, we learn a lot from the entire spectrum. And what we've been looking at in that journey is how do they make effective decisions. And there's a couple of things I'll look at. One is a micro way and then the macro way. The micro way is looking at how fast can CEOs and leadership teams know reality. And I think the title of Delphi this year is Fantastic New Realities, because reality's changed. Everything's changed. The world has changed. We've got some organizations who are so time-lagged from a reality of data that they're making really poor decisions off of old data. We've got some organizations who get their information really fast and react really quickly. So we do a lot of work with part of the BBC in the UK. And part of the BBC, we met one of the leaders a few weeks ago. He gets audience data every morning at 9:37 a.m., right? Why 9:37 a.m., I don't know, but 9:37, very specific. So he can't go more than 24 hours without knowing what the reality looks like. If you think of most organizations, how time-lagged is their information from when they're making decisions? So there is a way to shortcut this that we've seen in organizations too. So maybe I can get onto that as a practical how-to. But we've seen organizations take a very different look at understanding the reality of data. That's on the micro level. The macro level is, of course, looking at some of the big changes. I think, Alexia, as you pointed out, with decentralized decision-making in organizations is something that is not just a social change trend, but something we're also seeing in technology. I mean, let's look at the rise of Bitcoin as a technology. This is the ultimate in decentralized currency. This is something that's changing the way people are behaving in so many cases. So yeah, sorry.
It most certainly does. I won't ask you whether you believe in its future or not. It's an entirely different discussion. But yes, you're right.
Yeah, I mean, I believe in the technology, and I think it's showing us something really interesting about how we might move forward in so many areas of life. Whether the currency or not will survive, who knows? But yeah. So one of the things that we've looked at is looking at what are the consistent things we're learning about decision making when we look at organizations. So a few things. One is looking at the boldness of decision making. So how prepared are leadership teams to be bold and to push in terms of ideas and really be truly entrepreneurial? Because organizations start often with a very fired up entrepreneur and over time can fade and become managed. You know, the second one is when we look at growth. So again, how focused are leadership teams on growth and how do they understand what's actually happening in the market? The third area we look at is what we call diversity. Again, how diverse are leadership teams? I think the evidence is irrefutable that diverse leadership teams make more effective decisions. And then the final one is then looking at what we would call innovation. So how much time do organizations spend focusing on innovation? Crowe Global and Sol Crowe have focused on these four key pillars as a way to explain how to make effective decisions. And it's something that we've seen really impact organizations positively. Because what we're trying to do is translate, of course, human ambition, energy, enthusiasm, culture, values of an organization into something that equals shareholder value increase, into something that equals, if you're a charity, you want more donations. If you're an NGO, you know, we work with everyone from the UN to large corporates, and we've not yet met a CEO on this planet who says next year, just relax, chill out. You know,
we won't make any money.
We won't make any money, yeah. So one quick story before I finish is Mozo. So Mozo is something really interesting that I suspect not many people have heard of. And we have done quite a lot of work out in Mongolia, which was quite an exotic location for us. And one of the things we've seen in Mongolia over the last 2 years is a brand new car company. And you'll see them in the press soon, I suspect. But in 2 years, they've gone from nothing to a production of a combustion engine and an electric vehicle in a way that I've never seen happen in such a short space of time, from nothing to production.
How did they do it?
Well, I think, again, this is the thing, tremendously bold in terms of how they've done it, innovative, tremendously innovative, a relentless focus on growth by the CEO and the leadership team, and then also a tremendously diverse leadership population. So actually they embody everything that we talk about, and they've created something very special. If you look at the macro trends in a country like Mongolia, where you've got a high dependence on car imports, so if you remove that and produce them domestically, you're not only producing them cheaper, but you're skilling the national workforce, which in many cases is not done by a lot of multinationals, actually, so that's important. The second element is the pollution, so the ESG agenda. If any of you have spent any time in Mongolia, they burn a lot of coal in Mongolia because a lot of people who use coal to heat their homes. So the pollution is 27 times that of the World Health Organization's recommended level. And then also when you look at the other impacts of, again, production and the commercial performance of their organization. So it's one of the best descriptions or best examples we've seen of how you apply these four principles of decision-making into something that ends up, which is what we all want, which is a sustainable, profitable, growing company.
Very interesting take. The one thing that comes to my mind out of everyone's input is, how do we get everyone on the same page? Because we've put on the table a multitude of items, a multitude of thoughts and perspectives, And how do we incorporate all that within a corporation? Is your goal, my goal, and Yiannis' goal, etc.? How does a CEO or his team, or indeed the corporation as such, arrive at the same language?
Well, that is a matter of corporate culture, actually, not so much a matter of corporate decision. And you will never get everyone on the same page. It's impossible, because at the end of the day, the idea is not to have total uniformity. It would be such a complete disaster. The idea is to have people thinking differently and combining these different ways of thinking. We don't want everybody to think the same way, because that would be another form of imperialistic totalitarianism or capitalistic totalitarianism or whatever. But what we want is people thinking differently, being able to think differently, and combine these differences. And this is a matter of corporate culture. The thinking freely and acting freely is 100% a matter of corporate culture, and it's not very much embedded in corporate cultures in general, especially in multinationals. But it doesn't go a lot around, to be honest.
So from what you say, I actually tend to think that you think that more democracy is in decision-making in corporations, leads to better results, but does that exhibit itself on the bottom line? Do we have results from actually being more democratic, more open, or is it just a process somewhat disenchanting for some or somewhat alienating for others?
As Mr. Stathopoulos said yesterday, there is no prosperity without democracy. It's impossible. And this is something that we've lived through, all of us. And now at these very, very precarious times with the war, we see it again and again and again. It is democracy that works for the capitalistic system we live in. It is democracy that creates profits and that creates riches. That's a fact. It's an indisputable fact. Now, having said that, companies need to be relevant. And they need to be relevant with society. They need to be more and more, society asks of them to be corporate citizens. So if they're not relevant, and if they're, closed, as you said very well before, and if they just think about themselves and their profits, they're not going to be relevant to society anymore. Society will outcast them, and they will not make any profits. So it's rather simple.
So better results with more democracy. What do people think about that?
I can give you some numbers.
Sure.
I'll give you some hard facts evidence. So we looked in the UK, we measured the highest performing companies by their employee sentiment. So we were measuring essentially culture and how people felt about that. We took, and I'm an economist by training, so I like the numbers. We looked at the 37 companies who had the highest levels of employee engagement. And
employee engagement?
Yeah. And we tracked those companies. They were all public companies. We tracked them versus a FTSE 100 5-year return on a share index.
Yeah.
So the headline was, if you invested $100, €100 of your money, in 5 years in the FTSE 100, you'd return about $120 over a 5-year investment period. So not bad, but not the best. Not as good as Bitcoin, maybe. And then what we also looked at is you've invested the same $100 in the 37 companies that we knew had high levels of employee engagement, great cultures, communicate really well internally. The same $100 would have returned you $452 over the same time period. So I'm those sort
unlisted, they're not listed?
They are listed companies.
Oh, they are?
Yeah.
All right.
So this is irrefutable
engagement
data.
works wonders.
Tremendously, because it tells you more about the propensity to communicate with inside any organization of human beings. If an organization can learn fast, then of course it's probably more agile than an organization that learns slowly.
Wayne, it's very interesting that you say that, because just a while ago, Tommaso was talking about how too much information can be a bad thing. Now, if we exclude listed companies, which are obliged to publish their results quarterly, etc., and answer to the Capital Markets Commission on particular questions and so forth, why, in the view of how democratic a company should be and run itself, be the existence of an abundance of information a disadvantage?
Well, let me also challenge and I'll take it to a different level. is democratic the right word in a company? Because we talked about decentralized. Decentralized doesn't really mean that every decision is made by a group according to a majority, as we think of democracy. It means you have people clearly in charge of certain decision with a predefined set of responsibilities that everyone agrees with. So there's perhaps a democracy, I think, may be applied to the overarching structure of decision-making in a company, but then agility means that people are in charge. And I think that's a huge difference that we should consider between democracy intended for countries and democracy as applied to companies. And I'll give you one concrete example.
You must be referring to the benefits of accountability, if
exactly,
I take it correctly.
Which in my view is slightly different than majority vote. Like when companies need to make very hard decisions, not necessarily they make those decisions based on a majority. Sometimes a leader needs to cut through and bring that decision to life, because the decision of the majority may not be the right one. I would separate a bit the democracy as applied to countries and states and applied to companies. And for instance, if you consider the case of a multinational company, you were mentioning multinational companies. Companies like us sometimes go out of their traditional business, right? The concept of democracy would mean you apply your mindset as a majority from this business to the other one. But think about a tobacco company that goes into smoke-free and then suddenly into small kind of healthcare and wellness like we're doing.
An incredible contradiction.
Exactly. If you applied the same principle, same decision-making, democracy, the majority of this thinking to that, probably that business wouldn't go well. Instead, decentralization is the right way to approach that business, saying we have people in charge there who know that business much better than we do. We can consult, we can align, but ultimately they need to decide. Sorry, I'm diverting a bit, but on that word, democracy, because otherwise we know that business is not going to be successful.
Well, let's do a bit of a marriage. I think next to democracy, let's put the word initiative, and Yiannis mentioned this earlier. I was wondering, Yiannis, is initiative something which I pointed out is evident in the Israeli way of doing business, a part of Greek culture, or Wayne, tell us if it's global. Yanni?
I will get on this question. However, I would like to say something on the debate, democracy or not democracy.
Okay.
We're in Greece. So,
The
of course,
birthplace.
this is a hot war.
We're in Delphi, even more.
And in Delphi also. I don't know if the word democracy is relevant for business or not. I do not know. The only thing I know and I believe, because I have led companies with a lot of people, I believe on what we call situational leadership. Are times that you need really to release the creativity, kind of democracy, let's put it like that. People can participate, go for it, explore opportunities.
You mean to allow the creativity?
Yeah.
So you're actually holding the reins at all times?
Yeah. And there are other times that crisis arrives, immediate decision has to be made. You cannot ask everyone opinion. You will ask, but at the end of the day, you have to make a decision. So I'm a fan of situational leadership. Second, I agree on what he said. Can't say for business many things, structures, leadership, P&Ls, whatever. What I think is above all is culture. And culture is connected with people and leadership. So to come to our discussion back on decision making, a big difference versus the past I see is the following. When I brought up professionally, when somebody was asking you about the decision, you had to answer, I will choose this or that. The main word was or. Otherwise, what do you decide? In nowadays, although it sounds a bit contradictory, schizophrenic, making decision means the word and. Because you have to combine the young generation with the old generation. So you have to and. You have to ask people to deliver profit today, but to create value for tomorrow. You have to say deliver profit, take even the war now in Russia. A lot of companies have moved out of Russia. Their shareholders still ask for profits. And the and, not or, asking also to be in line with the public opinion. So it's much more complex subject, the decision making today. And this, it comes for a simple reason. Let me summarize it simply. Leaders of today have somehow to balance out the internal financially tangible value of profits with the external financially completely intangible value of environment, of society. Who measures that, in what sense? So I think leaders in our days has to be much more charismatic in a way, and in that way I think they can lead better and have better future for all of us.
So I think, Yiannis, I'm sure that the organizers of this forum will listen up to what you say, and next year we'll have the whole forum dedicated to this, which is, I think, not a bad idea. Wayne, a last comment from you.
I guess back to your question of how do we get people on the same page. So super quick story. There was a company who, they're a finance business, and I was asking one of their new recruits, they're a new graduate. I said, how many hours a day do you spend on TikTok? She's 22 years old, this lady. And she says to me, about 2 hours. And I said, no way, more like 4. And she's like, okay, 3 to 4 hours. I said, okay, of the 3 to 4 hours you spend a day on TikTok, do you spend those 3 to 4 hours in the evening or during the day? And she says, during the day. Right. So imagine, you've got a complex strategic message to communicate through a population who are largely remote workers in this situation to me, and you're fighting with your message against Justin Bieber's new trainers, and oh my God, a cat just jumped off a roof, and this is exciting content. So we have to create the content for our organizations in a way that feels more exciting, more enticing, because my attention span is under attack from so many other factions. And it's one of the central frustrations we feel from CEOs and leadership teams, that they've got these important messages, and how do you capture that audience? So in a way, it needs the skill of professionals like Alexia to be able to create the conditions and the communication that interests people, and that helps really to get people onto the same page.
Right. So actually combating TikTok or competing with TikTok can make money for you. That's, I think, a very useful piece, or I'd say it's food for thought for our future, for everyone. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your attention and for being with us. Thank you.
Thank you.